Good morning, everyone, and I promise you we will more than stick to time and end at the scheduled time. Essentially, we're here to discuss the trifecta of the development imperatives of the global South, including Africa, uh, which can be encapsulated by the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually go beyond those. Second, the opportunity that the world of business provides us today with the redistribution of supply chains globally and the push towards more reliable and resilient supply chains. And third, imperatives driving business decisions in the private sector, of course, but not just here in Africa, but across the world, and how these can impact the first 2 points that I'd made. So let's go straight into the meat of the conversation. I'd like to begin with the gentleman next to me, Minister Tito Mabine. Have I pronounced your name correctly, sir? Apologies if I haven't. Former finance minister, veteran of economic policy making, former head of the South African Reserve Bank, central bank. We are 6 years away from the SDGs and the target we set for them. We've also seen the world in turmoil, both the business world and the world of politics in turmoil in the past 2 or 3 years with COVID, with restructuring of supply chains. Are these two different imperatives, or are business and development moving towards the same, converging towards the same end?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, for succeeding to wake me up so early in the morning.
We could offer you coffee.
Yes, I think so. I normally start operating after 10 a.m., but anyway. I think we're having very good conversations here in Cape Town, and I think hopefully our conversations will cascade down to policymakers on the continent and of Africa and other parts of the world. Let me start by a very controversial statement. When these SDGs were being drafted by Jeffrey Sachs, who had his own understanding of what should happen. Maybe New York-based, with a particular thinking about what SDGs should be. I think most of us a bit asleep. We didn't engage in debate sufficiently with what we're talking about. So that's the first controversial statement which we can debate. The second controversial statement I want to make is are developing countries, and African countries in particular, its leadership fully accepting the role of the private sector? Or are we grudgingly still in the 1970s kind of Marxist way of thinking? Grudgingly accepting the private sector, but actually not accepting the private sector. I'll tell you why I say that. In this country, for example, you have a situation where the government would say that they would like to work with the private sector, but in practice, they're working against the private sector. In practice. I'll give an example. The current government is about to pass a law on the amendment to the Companies Act, the consequence of which very few people will want to become directors of private companies because it's against the private sector. And a whole set of legislations, laws which are against the private sector. Now, we are in the business, I suppose, of facilitating development, and we should focus on those things which are critical to the African people, for the development of the African people. What are those things? Let me start by saying, first, education for our children. Second, healthcare for the people. It's amazing how today you'll find so many African leaders coming to Cape Town or Johannesburg for medical care. But their own people cannot come to Johannesburg or Cape Town for medical care. And yet they should be focusing on building and strengthening medical care. So education, medical care, then infrastructure. All these other things we talk about are important, but infrastructure, agriculture, very critical. But then how do you get products from the farm to the market? That's infrastructure, the road, the railway, and so on. And finally, in my view, communication is very important. Because without communication, you can't do anything. Communication, not just rail infrastructure, but spectrum provision and so on. And I think the world has changed a bit since we developed the SDGs. We need communication. And COVID should have provided the opportunity for us to improve communication in Africa. The fact that we rely on Zoom and MS Teams, there's no African MS Teams. There's no African Zoom. We should have taken advantage of that period to develop our own systems. Let me stop there. Maybe before I stop, let me just say that, Trevor Manuel, myself, Alec Erwin, who is here, we spent quite a lot of time together with President Mbeki arguing for the debt relief for African countries, or the highly indebted countries, the so-called HIPIC initiative. And we managed to get debt relief for a number of countries, the highly indebted countries. I am sad to say that as we speak today, many of those countries have gone back to debt. There's been default in Ghana, default in Zambia, and so on. So all the work that we did has come to nothing because people have gone back to where we were when we were dealing with the EPIC initiative. Now, you can't be in a debt situation like that and still hope to achieve sustainable development goals. So the financial position of our countries is very important in this regard. Let me leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's a very good overview with which to start. Thank you. Aside from a very senior political leader and a senior economic policymaker, this panel has two people from the mining industry and two people from the world of finance and the banking industry, which is a good mix, really, because both of those sectors are very deterministic to what we're discussing today. So let me begin with the person to my extreme right, Bridget Motsepe. Bridget, I looked at your bio. You focus on mining, sustainable mining, ethical mining, especially in platinum, coal, chrome, and gold. For most of history, the world has not used the word ethics and mining together. How's it changing?
Thank you. I started in getting into the mining industry in 1986 as the first black producer of minerals in South Africa. And I started as a contract miner. Went on tenders in the big mining houses to build a mine. And also not just to build a mine, after building a mine, I would then also manage the mine. And so what happened after that? The law did not allow black people to own mines. And so I had to define legislation. But I come from, I'll tell you this little bit so that you understand what I'm going to say after. And I come from a royal rural village where we owned the minerals. And the mineral rights would be leased, we will then lease our minerals to the producers, and royalties will never be paid or money will not be paid. So the rural communities are very rich because they own the minerals that are underneath. South Africa was the only country in the world that did not have the state being the owner of the mineral rights. So it was very important when President Mbeki, my brother here on my left, Edward Irwin, and other ministers became the new dispensation government of South Africa. And we had to change the legislation from the old South Africa regime legislation to the new regime legislation of all departments of government. Now, what happened is that the state then became the custodian of the mineral rights in line with international practice. So we literally nationalized the mineral rights. So if all that you have on table is your mines, you can own. You own. But as soon as the minerals are underneath, the state is the owner. Then on a lease, on a lease basis, depending on the life of mine, you would then lease, and the state will then give you that lease. But the important thing is that the legislation of each department of government, whether it's mining, finance, trade and industry, agriculture, you name it, came with legislation that is called the charters and the B codes. Now, apart from building mines in South Africa, I also then started building mines outside South Africa, Anglo Gold Ashanti and all those other mines in Africa. But also, when Anglo went offshore, listing offshore, I then bought Shaft Sinkers, a company that Anglo created in 1961, and went global to build mines. Now, what I see in Africa is the following. We have adopted, the business we, and the political we, the models, the socio-economic political models, not so much political, but economic models of the Western world. Now, what happens is that when the Western comes into Africa, in the mining industry, you get the right to mine, and then you then dig a hole, you then extract, you explore, you exploit, you export. But what happens is that you leave ghost towns. Now, the issue here is we're not beneficiating. We're not creating the end product. We all become just the producer and the supplier of commodities and the supplier of goods and services and supplier of all those minerals that are now creating a second industry in the rest of the world. Now, I worry also that we were politically liberated, and I see in Africa where I've been mining, the economic liberation, economic colonialism is coming, because that's new colonialism. The ownership now is being systematically and gradually being transferred from the Western world to China. China's not stealing. China's not stealing. It's what we are doing as the African leaders in terms of the contracts that we signed with China. Now, South Africa does not allow that. We don't have a problem with China because we have laws. We have the B codes that say, and we have the legislative charters that say, if you come to my country and I'm a minister and you want a license to trade, you have to make sure if it's the mining industry or finance industry or whatever industry it is, in mining, you've got to make sure that not less than 30% must be in the hands of the historically disadvantaged South Africans. Now, it's a free market conditions, a willing seller and willing buyer that is now going to be the one that's going to negotiate, and you do a due diligence, and then you come up with the value of the mine, and you say, okay, it's X, and then if it's 30%, in that 30%, a person like me, Bridget Motsepe, cannot own the 30%, 100%. The only reason why Patrice, my brother, and I then have ownership 100% is because I started 6 years before him and started 6 years after me, 1986. Now that 30% is the following. Not less than 5% must be owned by historically disadvantaged communities, so the tribes, if they're there. Not less than 5% must be owned by workers. Not less than 20% of the 30% must be broad-based. Now, when you look at South Africa and you look at the ownership of the country, I did the research as the president of the South African Mining Development Association. There are two chambers in South Africa. It was then the Chamber of Mines, which is called the Middle Chamber, and the chamber I then created. We then gave shares, and all the companies have to make sure that a rural community the company will come with the balance sheet and the collateral. And the company will come to ABSA and the Rand Merchant Bank and any other banks and say, this is who we are. And these are my broad-based companies. And then the government, the bank then will look at the balance sheet and the bankable feasibility study and then give that loan. Now this company that is a black-owned entity, the 30%, will then make sure that the dividends that are paid will then pay the loan. And after some time, the unencumbered net value, ownership, 100% ownership, will then be given to that person. Now, what worries me, I was the keynote address speaker last month, 3 months ago, in the DRC. And as the Minister of Mines was there and the Chamber of Mines president was there. And I said, you were liberated in 1963. How many of the people in the DRC own mines? The minister said, no one. I said, Chamber President, are we really not owning mines here? No. And I said, but why? Then I made an example and I said, let me just make an example of some of the research that we did. From 2004 to 2014, we looked at 49 listed companies. There are more than 49 listed companies in South Africa, but at that time I looked at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Those 49 listed companies, the market cap was 2.574 trillion. Now, if by 2014, all those companies having 26% ownership allowed 49 companies in South Africa that are black-owned to have 669 billion ownership. So what I'm saying, because this is not my time, we're sharing, is the following. We have to make sure that we look at the culture that we have in terms of the way we do things. Transfer pricing, it should not be allowed. I'm the first person to go to Parliament and said, I'm not in my name. I'm not going to allow illicit capital and transfer pricing to happen. President Mbeki was great enough to go and create that transfer pricing committee with the Global Financial Integrity CEO sitting in that committee for the African Union. But in our country, the government of South Africa, our Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, after you, Minister Mboweni, then created the Judge Dennis Davis Commission. We, the business leaders of the world, and also the business leaders of Africa, must pay tax. If you don't pay tax and the government of Africa cannot produce what you need them to produce, then you come and you complain about there is no legislative uncertainty, political uncertainty, and we come with all these things. But it's a combination of a partnership. So those things should not happen. Beneficiation, we have to make sure that everything that we own must, in partnership with the Western world, foreign direct investment, partner together and build together and create the end product together so the factories can be done.
Thank you. That's it leads to discussions on several issues that you touched upon. But let me pick on one of those. Whether it is for mining, for development finance, for energy transitions, traditional sources of finance in the West are not always as, I wouldn't say generous, but as adventurous as or risk-taking as they once were. We've noticed this not just in Africa, but in other parts of the global south, including in India, where money for energy transitions and new energy projects, even rewarding projects, has not been coming simply because people with the resources and with the capital are wary of going into new areas and new geographies, which is perhaps a reflection of the world we live in. Africa has seen some of her transitions, Lucy Coke, in new money coming in from other emerging economies. China, which you've studied deeply, but also to some degree India and other parts of Turkey and other parts of the non-West, as it were. Take us through a contrast between, old sources of money and new sources of money, and are the imperatives different?
Thanks, Ashok. I think there are a couple of things that we can look at here, and then I'd also like to bring in another angle. I think that we're very quick to jump directly into that dichotomy between Western capital and then Eastern capital, which is code word for China, because we all know that China is. So we all know that China is a very important economic actor on the continent and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. But I think what we must also look at is, and this I wanted to bring in Bridget's point as well, is that we look particularly at the flows coming into the continent. And I think one of the things that is particularly interesting is we need to start looking at the flows that are coming from within the continent to other projects. So I will contrast, one of the things that I studied some time ago is trying to understand the difference between these capital flows. And one of the very interesting things, and why Chinese money was so much more interested in infrastructural projects on the African continent, perhaps at a time when the traditional sources of that financing were drying up, was because the considered payback period for a project was, or the time for, they effectively had patient capital and patient loans. So particularly because they were investing in long-term projects, a lot of the loans were very much around a project finance mechanism, as opposed to looking at the strength of a country's balance sheet to be able to pay for the loan. A lot of Chinese loans were actually tied around the actual, the ability of the asset that was being financed to generate the capital. And there are a number of intricacies around those different financing mechanisms, which I'm very happy to go into at a different time. But what was very interesting in that dynamic is the fact that we now had a multiplicity of financing, of sources of finance. But I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, particularly in terms of we are seeing a withdrawal from of international finance houses, particularly from areas that are considered higher risk, such as countries in Africa. And this is an opportunity for African banks to step in, fundamentally because these banks, because being based on the continent, there is a better understanding of those kinds of risks. There is a higher level of comfort. I mean, South Africa is no longer an investment-grade country, but there is an enormous amount of appetite for the banks, for South African banks, to invest and to finance the much required development of this country. And the increase in private power, or the financing of private power in South Africa, is actually an example of this. The challenges of our national utility are not news to anybody, and there has been an enormous uptick in privately financed power, which would not have been perhaps the case were we not in these current situations. But I think just to take a step back in terms of what the role of banks and finance houses can be in this dynamics, specifically in terms of a move towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Particularly coming out of the financial crisis, there was a paradigm where banks would seek to do no harm, which would be effectively to ensure that their noses were clean and that everything was above board and all due protocol and all corporate governance was observed. And increasingly, we are seeing a shift now that do no harm is not enough, that now there needs to be a proactive deployment of the resources that banks, and particularly in our context, African banks, have at their disposal to make a positive impact in the environment and in the societies in which they operate. And if we look at the resources, I mean, fundamentally, a financial intermediary or a financial institution, their most basic function is the efficient allocation of capital. And what efficient means can mean different things to different people. But if we were to recalibrate the definition of what efficient means, there is an enormous impact that could be made in the economy. And if you look at the resources that financial institutions have, so there is there is sort of a basket that we call financial resources, which it relates to capital, it relates to the risk appetite that an institution would have, and effectively how we calibrate who we're going to lend to and why. But there are also an enormous number of platforms in terms of the technology that we use, and networks in terms of the clients that we have within our networks and the wider impact that we can make. And as a second piece is again market efficiency, and I'm aware that market efficiency can mean different things to different people. But if we were to say efficient in the sense that the end user receives more out of that transaction, and that market efficiency means interoperability, then you suddenly have a situation where peers or banking peers who, in the normal course of events, are competitors, need to actually come together to create the kinds of infrastructure that not only banks and financial institutions themselves would use as a peer group, but also their broader end users, which range from your smallest person who has some kind of e-wallet, or your smallest in terms of quantum, sort of financial user who's perhaps just on their journey to financial inclusion, all the way up to the larger corporates. And this is something that it's incredibly important that when finance houses and banks in particular sit down to assess what their role is in achieving the SDGs. It's not, oh, we give so much to a foundation, or, this is part of our beautiful purpose statement that we're going to put on the walls of our building. But it really relates to how they deploy their core operations and their core function in society, and what principles they use to calibrate these, because there really is an enormous amount of difference that can be made. And it's not a dichotomy in terms of doing good for society and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals versus as seen as a trade-off for profit. They are fundamentally go hand in hand from a sustainability perspective.
Thank you. Very astute points, Lucy. I'd like to pick up on one of the issues you raised while moving to you, Nonhalana Majoli Nube. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if I haven't. While you come up with your presentation, one issue I'd like you to look at is how easy or how much better have financial institutions and banks in South Africa got in terms of mobilizing local capital as an alternative to capital coming from overseas for business in India, for business in South Africa, for more sustainable business in South Africa more broadly, and for the finance that is needed here for development and for economic advance.
Thanks. My name is Ntlantla. I know it's a difficult one. I just think that when one thinks about the banks and think about the banks in a Pan-African environment in the African continent, one must think about their role as bigger than the banks that would be in the US. Because bottom line is, if you look at the ESG, the social and the environment are equally important. And so if banks are not going to play a role in unlocking the value, both in terms of the African people and the African continent and the African assets, then that would be a problem. So if I look at what role can the private sector play and what role can the banks play, you mentioned the point that they are already playing a role in terms of renewable energy. But one point I want to make is we've got the biggest youth in the continent. And unless banks invest in youth, whether you're investing in them through the loans that the youth can access as entrepreneurs, or you're investing in their education, you will have a problem as a continent. And it's not a problem that is only going to be for government. It's got to be a problem for all of society. So for me, banks' role is one, investing in assets, which are the assets that in our continent are plenty, but the technology that will make bringing those assets into reality easier and more green. Bridget mentioned the point about mining. There's no way, suddenly we're going to wake up in the continent and say we're going to desert mining completely. But unless we come up with green technology as banks to unlock that mining, we would have been letting our continent down. Second point, if we don't invest in technology and in ensuring that our kids, our youth, have got the appropriate education to be able to lock into the digital world that we're facing, and banks can play a big role in that. And then finally, the whole issue of entrepreneurs and SMEs. Our continent, specifically when you talk about local finance, our continent is full of small businesses, and we are not full of corporates. And so unless banks look at models of how do you make sure that you can have products that are structured and that are blended with both DFIs and local finance, that both women and youth can access, we would end up with the same base of businesses in the continent. And so for me, I think that is one of the things that we need to look at. If you look at what the banks at the moment are doing, the financial institution, specifically in the continent, in terms of specifically on environment, you can see that if banks stop complaining about government and look at the gaps where they can invest, they can actually unlock a lot of value for society. I'll use South Africa as an example. Instead of complaining about how there's load shedding and ESCOM is not functioning, the bank started, investing and structuring into renewable power and renewable energy. Now, this is the fastest growing sector in South Africa and in the continent, and is bringing in the jobs we want, and is bringing in the returns we want, rather than wasting a lot of our time complaining about what government is doing or not doing. Of course, government must do what it needs to do. Maybe let me just give you another element. Education is a space where traditionally banks and private sector have gone and given their change just to make sure that they tick the box and say children are being educated, but the impact has not been there. But you can see now that there's a beginning of a shift on change, that if you invest, whether you're investing for soft impact, which is education or healthcare, you actually invest for returns, and that those must be measurable. Look at the number of private schools that are affordable, that have come up. So in my mind, one of the functions of banks is spotting those gaps where societal change can happen, but the returns may not be the super returns you get from mining, but they are more sustainable. And so for me, that's one of the things that the banks should be doing, and the financial institutions must be doing.
Thank you. I turn to the final speaker for this opening round, and we don't have much time after that, unfortunately. I've just been told. Richard Stewart, you are the Chief Regional Officer for Africa at Sibanye-Stillwater, which is, in a sense, a Made in Africa multinational. In the mining sector, moving from gold to the platinum group of metals to now lithium, I understand, which the whole world wants a piece of. The mining industry has traditionally been seen in Africa as extractive and not sufficiently sensitive to the needs of the community or to Africa's own completely legitimate aspirations towards economic development and actually processing those resources. How has your company helped change that?
Ashok, thanks very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating one, and you mentioned it earlier as well. There's no doubt mining historically has been seen as an extractive industry, but I dare say that's changing. And whether it's changing because of societal pressures or whether it's changing because companies just believe it's the right thing to do, I think more and more we're realizing that we absolutely have to be part of a sustainable development chain. And to me, at the heart of what lies of this is what I'd call stakeholder capitalism. It's a concept that we certainly embraced as a company when we started 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it wasn't yet a term. Back then, businesses still existed for shareholders. But maybe the best way I can explain it is how we tried to explain it at the time, which was actually using a tree, ironically. We call it our Mdoni tree. And how that works is it says the roots of the tree which make a business thrive, those are your values. Your values are essentially your constitution. What a constitution is to a country, the values are to a company. That is what guides the way you operate. the trunk of that tree is its people. That's what gives it the strength. No matter which sort of business you're in, ultimately the people are what make that business. Now, the canopy of the tree are the stakeholders. And at the time, we actually spent a lot of time engaging with various stakeholders. And what are those? You get your communities, government, suppliers, customers, employees. We included the environment as a stakeholder, which 10 years ago raised a lot of eyebrows. So today, ESG is common. But putting the environment down as an official stakeholder 10 years ago, we got a lot of questions about that. But then critically, what lies at the heart of stakeholder capitalism is if that company is profitable, the tree will bear fruits. And the fruits are the values that accrues to all stakeholders. And what I think is really important is to define and understand what that value is to each stakeholder. So often we assume what value is to a stakeholder, but have we actually engaged with them on it? What does value mean to a community? I can tell you value to a community in a mine in Montana is very, very different to value to a community in a mine in Rustenburg. And you need to understand what that value is. Shareholders, it's normally quite easy. It's around capital growth and dividends. Governments, it's around taxes, but even governments quite often have got their own ideas on what value means to them. So this notion of stakeholder capitalism, and I come to the last part that's critical, is the capitalism part. Because what grows the tree is profits. I think as a business and as the private sector, we are not NGOs, we're not charities. That value comes from growing the size of the pie and ultimately understanding how better we can separate it. Now, I guess how do I sort of translate then into what we see in Africa and what this, and what generally, and what this means in terms of stakeholders? Well, mining, for example, I think is quite a unique business in a lot of ways. The first thing about mining is its long life. Very high barriers to exit. So once you've built a mine, it tends to last for 30, 40, 50 years. You can't exit it easily. The second unique thing about mining is, unlike manufacturing where you can build a factory anywhere in the world depending on what gives you the most competitive advantage, a mine is stuck where the ore body is. So once you've built it, it's staying there, and it's staying there for 50 years. It's an incredible base business to build off. The third aspect to mining is it's resource intensive. So it utilizes a lot of bulk commodities. It utilizes water, energy, people. It utilizes extensive supply chains. Now, why do I raise this? I think if we often hear a lot about beneficiation. We often hear a lot about ownership. I think these are important aspects, but if we really want to move ahead and develop on the SDGs, what we've got to think about is stakeholder capitalism. And how you can use a mine here, let me use an example of Johannesburg. Johannesburg was built on the back of gold mining. Today, gold mining probably contributes less than 2 or 3% to Johannesburg's GDP. Ironically, gold was never beneficiated. Gold was mined out the ground, shipped across the world, and put it back underground in a vault. Bizarre. But absolutely no beneficiation, no ownership. What built Johannesburg was the supply chains that developed around those operations, supporting the operations, developing tertiary businesses to support the businesses supporting mining. And this is the approach in my mind that we absolutely have to adopt as a responsible private sector, and how we impact stakeholder capitalism. It's about using these industries as a base to further grow further industries. So, in my mind, what do we need to do to take this concept of going beyond mining being an extractive industry to mining being a developmental industry? I fundamentally think that there are three things we really need to consider. The first one is that business, in this case mining, but I dare say you can apply this to any business, it has to adopt the approach of stakeholder capitalism. The private sector needs to realize it's not just there for shareholders. They are a very important stakeholder. They provide the capital. They need to be looked after. But it's about all stakeholders, and it's about realizing that value you as the private sector need to bring to all stakeholders to make it sustainable. I think the second one is the role of governments and the state. What is critical, as I mentioned now, is what's made these countries grow is the surrounding businesses and economies that have grown around it. It's government's job to enable those to grow. What does government need to do to promote businesses coming in to support it? What is their absolute goal and value addition? Is it about growing the economy, or is it about a different agenda? And that needs to be well understood, and it's got to be about enabling the private sector to deliver economic growth. And the third aspect, I'd say, is around communities and civil society. Communities and civil society also need to realize that they are stakeholders to business growth. Too often, again, it comes down to being a beneficiary. Owning mineral rights, what does that mean? Are you automatically a beneficiary? I once had a professor that told me while a metal is still in the ground, it's a rock. doesn't have a lot of value. Unless you can extract that and process it, there's no value. Be a stakeholder to part of that economic growth and ultimately growth. So to me, it's a combination of really all stakeholders coming together and recognizing the role that they can play and moving well beyond just being an extractive industry, but actually a base industry of which we can grow significant economies around the continent. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Unfortunately, the organizers have given me a very hard stop, a guillotine really, which expires in 98 seconds. That will prevent us from having a deeper conversation. Perhaps I could request the minister to sum up today's roundtable for us.
I wanted to say something before we go, which might be something that to think about during the course of these conversations. South Africa is a very strange society, a society in transition. And one of the things to bear in mind about South Africa can be summarized in the following phrases: race, class, and gender. So, and then under those categories, one could talk for a long time. I say this because when you talk about realizing these important goals we're talking about, access to finance is very important. Without access to finance, all these things we're talking about won't happen in South Africa. Banking. And in banking, I've discovered, I'm also involved in banking, by the way, and mining. What I've discovered in banking, after leaving the central bank where I was the regulator, I'm now the regulated, is that forget about these chief executives of banks who are black and women who are being paraded here and so on. Sim Shabalala, chief executive of Standard Bank or this and that. That's not the banking. Banking is a credit committee. That is the real bank. And until we crack the credit committee, we are just in a French breakfast picnic in South Africa. It is them who make the decisions about whether to extend credit or not. It's not the chief executive. I leave that race, class, gender, and the credit committee. Think about that. Thanks a lot.
Race, class, gender, and equity. Thank you so much, panel. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to hand you back to the organizers.